virtual St. Peter's. Welcome to our virtual St. Peter's. I'm going to start with some introductions. We're going to be looking briefly this evening at the work of Sir George Gilbert Scott and his restoration of St. Peter's in Northampton. Sir George Gilbert Scott, or as he preferred, Sir Gilbert Scott, gets terribly confusing. And when we get onto his family, you'll see how complicated it is because they seem to be very short of Christian names in their family. The name George Gilbert Scott may be familiar to you, perhaps not, but it should be. He was actually the leading architect of what became known as the Gothic Revival style. The term Gothic Revival applies to the use in the 19th century of designs based on art and architecture from medieval Europe. Sadly, George Gilbert Scott's Gothic Revival work was largely rejected throughout the 20th century. And the turning point probably came with that campaign that was led by Sir John Betjeman to save the Midland Hotel at the front of St. Pancras Station. That hotel has now been fully restored and is now known as the St. Pancras Renaissance London Hotel. I hope that this evening that this talk will lead in a small way to a little better understanding and appreciation of Scott's work. But before we go too far, let me introduce myself. I know Jean has given you a brief introduction, but there's just a few other points I just wanted to set the scene. I was born in Northampton. I moved away in 1985. I'm not a professional historian, having worked most of my life in IT and project management. I have, though, always had an interest in history and in Northampton in particular, and can actually remember the first time that I visited St. Peter's in the early 1970s to take some photographs for a school history project, rather unimaginatively named Northampton Past and Present. It rather focused more on the past, I have to say. I and a school friend used to spend quite a few days in our holidays doing what is now become to be known as church crawling, going around the county by bicycle. And I have to say, I'm indebted to that friend. He's actually made a career out of architecture. I haven't, sadly. But he introduced me to the series of books called The Buildings of England by Nicholas Pevsner, which have been with me through this journey that I've travelled on over a number of years. I do have a wider interest in church history too, and have been a member of Congregational Methodist, and I'm currently a member of a Baptist church here in Sussex. I edited the 1851 religious census for the Northamptonshire Record Society and have published a guide to researching nonconformists for the Northamptonshire Family History Society. So if you like, this is my first foray into the Anglican world. Someone else I'd like to introduce you to is the Reverend Sargentson. He's actually really quite important in the story of St. Peter's, as he wrote the definitive history of the church, which I suggest has not been bettered. It was written at the very beginning of the 20th century, when the Reverend Sargentson was rector of the church of St. Peter's. And I have a short biography coming out on Sargentson to be published by the Northamptonshire Record Society, hopefully in October of this year. So you may want to look out for that. I guess my own work background, one of the things that really interests me is how projects were managed in days gone by without all the sophisticated tools that we hear about today. What better project to investigate than the building or a restoration of a church? On reading Sargentson's history of St. Peter's, I came upon George Gilbert Scott, who I knew was of national significance. But did Scott manage the restoration of St. Peter's, or was it one of his staff or a junior? In fact, this was a criticism often levelled at him during his lifetime. It turns out that he was actually very hands-on with his projects, as we shall see. This was something like over 100 new builds of churches and over 400 restorations around the country like St. Peter's, and one or two in Europe as well. In the early stages, he attended meetings of the local architectural society, who were responsible for overseeing the project. He spoke at length on two occasions. First, to outline his approach to the restoration in principle. And then after conducting some investigations, he presented his proposed plan of work or possible plans of work. And he presented them to the committee and priced them up. And then they went forward and the project then went forward to tender. And as we will see, he actually produced some of the plans himself. But before we start to talk about St. Peter's, I just want to fill in a bit of the background about George Gilbert Scott himself and his family. What made him the man that he was? Well, like many people, it was really a combination of both family and where he grew up, the circumstances of his upbringing. And there were some good things, and there was one of the two things that were perhaps weren't quite so good by our standards. George was the grandson of a very well-known Buckinghamshire clergyman, the Reverend Thomas Scott, who was nicknamed the Commentator on account of his immensely popular commentary on the whole Bible. The Reverend Thomas Scott was a very close friend of the abolitionist, the Reverend John Newton, who you may recall was the author of the famous hymn, Amazing Grace. All three of Thomas's sons were clergymen. One of those, George, was George's father, and he became rector of Woppenham in South Northamptonshire. Interestingly, one of George's brothers, also Thomas, succeeded his father as the rector of Wappingham. So we've got three generations here of members of the Church of England, or you could possibly argue there's four, which is interesting in itself. But not for our George Gilbert Scott. Scott was actually born in Gilbert in Buckinghamshire, and he died in London. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, and he appears in the relief of one of the friezes on the Albert Memorial, next to Augustus Pugin, who's another very famous architect. This is particularly interesting because it was Scott who actually designed the Albert Memorial, although he didn't design the frieze that goes around it. That was left to a couple of other people. But there are a number of panels on each side of the monument. So if you're ever there again, have a look at the side and you'll find that one side, the frieze, is actually all architects, and they're all shown in relief. So I think this is Pugin, and we've got Scott here, who's just shown in profile on that side. Let's dig a little deeper into Gilbert Scott's family. His father, Thomas, as I said, was the fourth child of Thomas the Commentator. He was born in London in 1780 and was appointed curate in 1806 of the village of Gilbert, which is about 1.5 miles from Buckingham. The appointment was probably due to his father's local connections. There was no parsonage at Gilbert, so Scott's father designed one in 1809, and it was constructed by a Mr. Wilmore of Buckingham, a local builder. Until the house at Gilbert was finished, the Scotts lived in the parsonage house in Buckingham, where the first three children were born. They moved into their new house in April 1810, and George Gilbert Scott was born there on the 13th of July, 1811. Thomas Scott, his father, had a great interest in designing buildings. And when his church developed structural faults in Gilbert, it had to be demolished in 1827. So he produced the designs for a new plain classical building, as we see here. And he chose Wilmore again to be the builder. His son, George Gilbert Scott, who is the subject of this evening's talk, later made a comment that his father actually had very little idea about architecture, and that Wilmore was actually allowed to do more or less as he pleased. But whether you like this building or not, this is Thomas Scott's designed church in Gilbert, which if you've ever been in the area, you can go and have a look at. To supplement his stipend, Thomas Scott, George's father, ran a small private academy to educate young men who wished to enter the Church of England. These students lived with the Scott family, which meant that Mr. and Mrs. Scott had little time to devote to their children. George's older brothers, Thomas and John, were expected to educate the younger ones. And George recalls that he was thrashed by John when he stumbled over his Latin. The two older brothers had formal educations. Thomas went to Cambridge, and John was articled to a Dr. Rumsey in Chesham, but he later abandoned a medicine career, and he too went to Cambridge, and from there both men became clergymen. By the time that it was ready for George to go, there was no money left in the family for formal education. And it was also seen that he probably wasn't quite clever enough to go to university. Amid this intensely academic environment, he was left to work out his own destiny. So apart from the lessons administered by his brothers and occasionally by his father, George spent much of his time wandering around the neighbourhood. George was left very much on his own to discover the joys of local buildings. Gilbert, of course, had nothing of architectural interest, save what his father had built. But within 4 miles, there were several interesting medieval churches to explore. Fast forward about 10 years, and George Gilbert Scott had started his own career as an architect. And we find him in Northampton, where he actually has 4 buildings to his credit. 2 of those are new builds, and 2 of them are restorations. And we'll look at them briefly, and then we'll spend some time looking at St. Peter's in particular. The 4 buildings that Scott has been involved in Northampton are St. Edmund's Hospital Chapel, which many of you may not be aware of, but it's along the Billing Road and it's in the grounds of, sorry, I'm getting mixed up here. St. Edmund's Hospital here is on the Wellingborough Road, the former workhouse, built in 1836. Along the Billing Road, in the grounds of St. Andrew's Hospital, we have the chapel, which was a complete new build, and it was built in 1863. And before we go on to St. Peter's, we also need to mention Holy Sepulchre, which Scott was also responsible for the restoration work there too, between 1860 and 1869. And then also finally, we've got St. Peter's. So let's just have a quick look at the workhouse. The Wellingborough Road workhouse was designed and built in 1836, early in Scott's career when he was in partnership with William Moffat. Over 10 years or so, Scott and Moffat designed more than 40 new workhouses in the wake of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Although on paper a partnership, the two seem to have worked completely independently, Moffat in the southwest and Scott in the East Midlands. Scott also sought out church work in addition to these new institutions. He networked around these former contacts of his father. And he designed Brackley, Towcester, Kettering and Oundle workhouses, as well as this Northampton one. All are of the same basic cruciform plan, although they do vary significantly in size and overall style. And in fact, what remains of the Northampton one is actually quite a small part of the original complex that was built on the Wellingborough Road site. Holy Sepulchre in Sheep Street was a project of Scott's that immediately followed St. Peter's, or at least it should have done in theory. In its original state, as we can see here, this picture from 1811, Holy Sepulchre was actually quite a small church. It had its famous circular nave, and then it had a chancel here and 2 small aisles. But as the town was growing quite rapidly, the size of the building was actually totally inadequate for the services that they were trying to conduct here. And Scott's plans did 2 things. He reordered what was going on inside. So he put new fittings, new pews into the building to increase the capacity. But he also extended both the chancel and these 2 aisles and built an additional aisle on the north side of the site as well. So you can see that where you could see the side of the round nave here, that is now completely obscured by the new nave that has been built along the north side of the building, which is what we can see today. The issue was, though, that this building was in a pretty sorry state and needing to be built. But there was also a problem with St Giles as well, and that needed some urgent renovation work. And the town decided that work should proceed on St Giles before Holy Sepulchre. So Holy Sepulchre actually had to wait 10 years before it got its increased capacity. The work took 9 years to complete. As I say, it doubled the size. And interestingly, about 10 years later, George Gilbert Scott's son, John Aldred Scott, who we'll also hear about later, was involved in some further works in this building too. And finally, the real gem of Scott's work in Northampton is this chapel at St Andrew's Hospital. So it was built in 1863, but if you happen to walk past it, you'd think, gosh, that's quite an old building, isn't it? And the reason for that is it's built completely in a 14th century architectural style. It's built from Northamptonshire sandstone, and it's got Collyweston tiles on the roof as well. So he was being very sensitive to building materials that were typically used by churches in Northamptonshire. There are numerous carved heads around this building, around the windows. And if you ever get a chance to have a look around this building, even just on the outside, it's interesting to note that although at first sight the windows all look the same, each window is actually different. The tracery is different, and these little pieces of stonework at the ends of each of the arches, each one of those is different too. So it really is quite an interesting building. It creates the impression that the building has been built over many years. We'll just have a glimpse inside the building. And whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to have a drink. Now, not all of this is Scott's work. Some of it was done later, but it just gives you an overall impression of the building. And again, like the windows on the outside, the windows on the inside, each window is different on the inside in terms of the tracery, obviously, but also the way that it is decorated. So it really is quite an interesting mix. And it's got these oak pews, and each pew end is different. It's got a different carving on the end of it. So it really does create quite a pleasing experience. So returning to St Peter's, our restoration story perhaps begins, or I suggest it begins, with Miss Anne Baker, sister of a gentleman called George Baker, a historian, who are both residents of what's known as Hazelrigg House in Mayfair Fair. In about 1839, Anne Baker commenced an incredible conservation project on her own. For 11 years, she painstakingly removed the plaster by hand with a bone knife to uncover exquisite series of Norman carvings from the various pillars around the church. And after 2 centuries of being covered with white plaster, Anne was able to unveil the remarkable foliage, scrollwork, birds, beasts that lay beneath. So what of George Scott and his relationship with St Peter's? Specifically, do we consider it to be a restoration, or was it like the Holy Sepulchre, a reordering? Actually, it was a bit of both. By the late 1840s, St Peter's was in a pretty sorry state, internally and externally. It was cold, it was damp, there was little lighting inside apart from candles, and there was no seating. So imagine that contrast to today. It was also well known that the building had origins in the 12th century, but like all buildings of that age, it did need repair from time to time. And over the years, new features have been added, and some features of the building have been removed during those later changes. And as crises arose, like the collapse of walls or even the tower itself, so things had to be patched up. So the challenge for somebody like George Gilbert Scott as a restorer was what to restore it to. And it was a challenge that Scott took very seriously. He saw that his initial analysis of the building as a key stage in his design process. It was also clear that his meticulous study of older buildings that he had gained over many years of personal study, both in their form and construction techniques, served to educate him in his professional career, both in restoration and the design of completely new buildings. So, from my point of view, asking my question, how was the project organised? Well, responsibility was given to give them their full title, the Architectural Society of the Archdeaconry of Northampton. So it was an Anglican body comprised of the great and the good of the Church of England, architects and historians. In December 1848, a committee was formed by the Society, like they do, and by February 1849, a subcommittee was entrusted with reporting on the actual condition of the building, if they really did need to go and have a look. So who were the key players? Well, this is particularly interesting because understanding who the players within the committee are gives us a bit of a clue as to the direction of the restoration. There are actually 5 key members: Matthew Bloxham, Charles Hartshorne, George Paul, Henry Rose, and Sir Henry Dryden. And in summary, Bloxham was from Rugby. He trained as a solicitor, but only found work as a court clerk. And in 1829, he published the first of many editions of his Principles of Gothic Architecture. Hartshorne was also a historian and a cleric, and he was at the time the curate of Cucknell, and later became rector of Holdenby. Paul was a writer on religion, church architecture and history, and was also the vicar of Welford. Rose was the rector of Brinkton and also an architectural historian. And Sir Henry Dryden, who seems to have held the whole thing together, originated from his family home was Canon Ashby, and was a very enthusiastic archaeologist and antiquary. But these were not just local characters. Significantly, George Paul, together with Matthew Bloxham, were nationally recognised and seen as advocates of the Gothic revival style. They worked very quickly, and in just those few weeks, at the end of March 1849, the committee made the decision that the work should be entrusted to Mr. G.G. Scott, as he was simply known at that stage. Scott too worked very quickly. In just 6 weeks, he had visited Northampton, and on the 7th of May, he presented his first report to the committee. In his report, he proposed 2 possible courses of action. And I quote, "To restore the whole of the fabric in the Norman style at an estimated cost of £2,150, or to preserve, with certain exceptions, the present features of the various styles, with decorated restorations to the east end and the roof, the cost being at £1,750. And you'd think on the basis of costs that it was an easy decision for the committee to make, but it wasn't quite as simple as that, because Scott went on to say the most significant part of his recommendation that he should be guided by the style of the restoration, by the roof and the east end, in particular by the remains that might be uncovered during the repairs. And we'll see what he actually found. But before we consider the actual restoration, we'll have a look at a very useful plan of the building. It's a plan that's probably very familiar with you because we still use it today. It appears in Sargenson's History. It was produced for that particular book, but it does helpfully indicate the various dates of construction of different parts of the building. And I don't know if you've looked at this in detail before, but I just want to highlight 1 or 2 points that really leap out at you as being a little odd. The first thing to notice is that this, what is the east end, looks like it's tacked on. Well, it really is tacked on. Before George Gilbert Scott started work, the church actually ended just about here, or possibly even here. Somewhere across here, that was the east end of the church. And when they dismantled this wall because it needed dismantling and rebuilding, they discovered that there were foundations for a much larger building. It extended further to the east. So this was really what Scott was getting at. He had a hunch that there was something strange about this building, and this was an area that was extensively worked on during the restoration, as we will see. Another item to look at is the pattern of the pillars within the church. You'll see we've got some major pillars, and then there's some like minor ones that sit between. And there's 3 arches here that form what is today known as the chancel. And then we've got 2 pairs of 2s, so it goes 2, 2, but then strangely, it's only 1. Now, why is that? It almost looks like they perhaps ran out of money. Well, what actually happened is that sometime in the past, this tower that is standing here was actually another arch width further in this direction, in a westerly direction. And the tower fell down, the west end was rebuilt, and the tower was moved closer in towards the church. So the nave was actually shortened at that stage. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So turning to the East End, and Scott is not particularly polite about this. He describes it as being miserable and mean. And there's several aspects of the restoration that could consume the architectural historian. But the 2 that I'm going to focus on is discussing this east wall. And for the geographically challenged, that's the one behind the altar opposite the tower. And I'm also going to talk about the tower itself. This particular picture is a fake. It's my own fake, and it's not done particularly well. I've taken an existing photograph, and based on a plan that was produced in 1807, together with Scott's description of the building as he found it before work commenced, this is my suggestion of one of the possibilities of what the East End actually looked like. I actually doubt whether these windows, these lower windows, actually appeared at all. I think they possibly didn't. I think these are Scott's additions as well. So basically, before he started work, this East End wall would have been about 18 feet closer towards the nave. So it would be roughly where the 2 aisles end at the moment. So you haven't got the chancel extension. This rectangular pillar here and here, these buttresses, those would have been there. And this interesting round buttress that is against the wall, Scott actually comments on. And if you're ever anywhere around the church, walking around the outside of the church, I always find the outside much more interesting than the inside, because restorers don't tend to cover up details on the outside if they can get away with it, because it costs and people don't tend to worry about it too much. But if you look at the base of the particular buttress and look right down the bottom, I haven't got a photograph of it, but it's got the same sort of crow's feet that you'll find at the bottom of the piers in the nave. So if you compare that, you realize that they are of the same date, they're the same design. So you can imagine if these 2 windows weren't there and you just got these 5 lights here quite high up, it would have been quite dark inside the building. So what does Scott actually say? In Scott's words, the alteration which strikes the eye is this partial rebuilding of the East End. It is quite clear that this end retains its ancient position. Well, he was actually incorrect on that point, as we'll see. The 2 principal buttresses and the small round buttress below the east window are clearly in the main original, though probably partly reconstructed. And the string course is also ancient as well, which I assume is referring to this course here, which actually continues around the side of the building. He continues, it's also not improbable that if this wall was taken down, fragments might be found which would furnish sufficient guide for the restoration of these windows, in which case their restoration would become desirable, as the present east window is of the meanest description. The oak lintel of the window appears to have been formed out of a moulded tie beam of the decorated period. So I'm assuming there was some sort of oak lintel up here supporting the stonework above. Now, this is not St. Peter's, this is St. John's Hospital Chapel in Bridge Street. And why is it here? Well, the reason it's here is Scott goes on to say, he's really got a thing about this window. He says, the meanness of the present window seemingly to render it unworthy of its position. If in removing it, sufficient guide should be found to the restoration of the Norman lights, I think it would be quite allowable. Otherwise, I would suggest a simple decorated window, perhaps like that in the chapel of St. John's Hospital. So we can actually go and have a look at that window. So this is the window, or the style of window, that we could have ended up with at the end of St. Peter's had things turned out differently. So what actually came about? Well, Scott was correct on 2 points, the design and the date, but not the position. And during the building work and the removal of the east end, amidst the materials of the wall, whose last erection was actually proved by a coin of Charles I, it was found near the foundations, and therefore the restoration couldn't have been earlier than the beginning of the monarch's reign. Charles I commenced his reign in 1600. It was reported by the Reverend Thomas James, who was the vicar of Sivertoft, another clergyman, who I gather was actually the supervisor of the sort of detailed work of the project, because he seems to be producing all the reports for the sort of 18 months it took to do the work. And the Northampton Mercury newspaper was actually quite faithful in reporting on these various meetings. So that's a really useful resource. And on the 12th of October, 1850, the Northampton Mercury says, the greatest find was reported by the Reverend Thomas James to the Architectural Society on October 1850, reveals that during a careful dismantling of the east wall, it was possible to establish the Norman design. The interior stones of the Norman work, although long embedded in the more modern wall, had their original position indicated by thick coats of architectural calidor. Now, I didn't know what calidor was, and I don't know if anybody else knows what calidor was, but my best guess is I've done a bit of searching on Google, and I've came up with something called Rowland's Calidor, which was actually a Victorian cosmetic. So I assume it was some sort of face paint. So I guess that's what the Reverend Thomas James is actually referring to, that these stones, which were actually on the internal surfaces of the building, were actually covered with, you know, the lichens, the mosses, etc., and they're just general aging. So it would have been a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, working out which stone went where. But by that process, they were able to reconstruct and turn the stones around and rebuild this east end that we see today. And as I've mentioned, it was also discovered that during that demolition work, that they found the foundations of the extension of the chancel that we see today. So they rebuilt it on that particular site. So let's now go along to the other end of the building, to the tower. Now, Scott didn't rebuild the tower, but he did make some interesting observations about it, and I just want to touch on those. And as the saying goes, there's nothing to see here, is there? Or is there? Well, it's not as it seems. And I suspect many of us have looked at this building and have had, you know, puzzles about it, about, you know, why parts there, you know, they don't seem to be functional. There's misalignment of the polychromic stonework. So it just sort of gives you the clue that something's been going on here. But Scott focuses on this arch here that's at the west end of the tower, which is probably one of St. Peter's most famous features. And he says, this arch has often perplexed me, perplexes us. When taking a cursory review of the church, I found it nonetheless unintelligible on the more minute examination too. Its size and amount of ornament it exhibits would lead one once to the conclusion that it had been a doorway, while its height from the ground and the fact that the base mould, having run unbroken below it, would again preclude that idea. And it would appear to leave no alternative than it had been a window. And both of these hypotheses are rendered doubtful by the entire absence of any appearance of a jamb. That's the side verticals, if you like. You know, there's nothing that continues down here. Not seeing any external clue to a decision of the question, I had several incisions made into the wall in expectation of finding portions of a jamb. So he suspected that some of this stonework here had been placed over an existing doorway or an existing window. But strangely, he found no evidence of a jamb, and he found no evidence of any sort of capital or a pillar or anything here at the sides. And he goes on, next I had a deep incision made into the work between the lintel and the interior arch. So he went round onto the inside of the tower, and after much trouble was cut so deep to meet the opening I had made from the exterior. From this, I found that the exterior and the interior arches agreed in position. So if you look inside, inside the tower, you'll find there is a corresponding arch on the inside, and the two are actually aligned. The real clincher comes when he tells us, I was informed by the clerk, that's the parish clerk, that there are foundations extending 8 or 9 feet from the tower westwards, and that prevents the digging of graves there. And that's quite obvious even today when you walk around this area here, just in the west side of the tower. There is actually one grave in the centre. It's the famous grave of William Smith, the geologist. But there are no other graves in this area here. And the reason for that is that the original tower foundations are in this area here. So clearly, what we see today was actually rebuilt. It's an amalgam of materials that were part of the original tower. So it's perhaps like, you know, when a child knocks down a tower of Lego and sort of approximately builds it back together as best as they can with the pieces that they've got available. Sorry, I digress. There were many other considerations of the restoration and several other discoveries. And always Scott was trying to return the building to the best of its original style and form. And other work that needed to be done was the roof. That was a major issue. The existing roof was quite a flat roof. And I've included an illustration here that is from 1807, again, before restoration work took place. And you can see how significantly flatter the roof is here compared with the roof today. And here's a plan that was also produced about 1807, and it shows us the design of that east end as it was before restoration. And it's this plan where you can see that there are actually 5 openings on that window at the side, and the little round buttress is evidenced here just slightly. The other thing I'd like you to just take note of is the position of the font. It's a bit like the TARDIS at St. Peter's. It's moved around a bit and it keeps popping up in different places. So as we look at these different plans, spot where the font has moved to and then think about where it is today. I'll just leave you to look at that for a moment. I'll take another drink. And this is a plan that I've obtained from the Lambeth Palace Library. They actually have the archive for the, I think it's called the Incorporated Society of Church Rebuilding. It was an organisation that operated through the 19th century and was involved with the funding and the authorisation of works on churches within the Church of England. And many of the architectural archives still survive. And there is one particular drawing that I found, this one of St. Peter's, which shows the new proposed internal layout of the church, which is not dissimilar to what we see today. Apart from the fact it's got lots of pews here in the tower, but other aspects are the same. And you can see the font has moved. It's moved here up to the tower position that is familiar to us. And if you look down here in the bottom right hand corner, there's a bit of a squiggle, which the quality isn't particularly good, but I've enlarged it. And I think you can just about work out that it says George Scott, and then it says ARCH, and it runs off the edge of the page. So presumably it read architect. George Scott. So there he is. That's his drawing. So absolute proof that the man was actually involved in the design and detailed design of not just the work he did on the outside, but how it was going to work as a church after the restoration work was completed. And here's an interesting picture. It takes us back a bit. This is a postcard that dates from the early 20th century. So it's a little different to what we see today, but it's closer to the internal appearance of the church as it was after restoration. But there's quite a few things here that have actually since disappeared. Probably the most obvious is the gas lighting pendants. I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. There's an organ here, an organ case here that you just see the side of, which is not the organ that is there today. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. There was a stone pulpit that Scott designed, and this low stone chancel screen, if you like, but that too has been removed. So quite a few changes there that have taken place internally. And I think it just serves to illustrate that, you know, fashions do change and practicalities, and people get a bit upset sometimes about the way churches perhaps change in time. And they say, well, it's always been like that. But when you look back at old pictures, that you see, oh, it wasn't quite like that. You notice all these extra chairs have been put down the aisle, obviously trying to get maximum accommodation. The font is interesting. I talked about the font, the way that it moves around. The octagonal font dates from the 14th century, and it's probably contemporary with rebuilding of the aisle walls. But it was reset in this position in 1944. It's actually the third position that it's had in the church since 1850. And we know it was further down the aisle prior to restoration. And Gilbert Scott actually designed the cover, the top. So this sort of conical cover that it's got is actually designed by George Gilbert Scott. And this is a modern picture that's only taken a few weeks ago. But I think it really demonstrates the drama that Scott has actually been able to create. Because one of the other aspects is that he actually lowered the nave floor. And he's actually created steps up into the chancel and then a further step up to the altar. So you get this sort of very much sort of looking upwards towards the altar effect. And staying with the Scott family, George Gilbert Scott died in 1878. And his architectural practice was actually taken on by his son, who in turn became quite a famous architect himself, John Aldred Scott. He was Gilbert Scott's second son. And in the same year that his father died, John Aldred Scott was commissioned to redecorate, to do further work on this East End. And John Aldred Scott is actually responsible for this stenciling that you see on the east wall. And he was also responsible for this reredos, which was supposed to be a triptych, you know, the normal sort of three-panel arrangement. But because of the location of the windows here, he's actually had to modify his design. So you've got a crucifixion picture in the center, and then you've got St. Peter, St. Matthew, St. Mark, and St. Luke in these different panels at the side. So they've been sort of shortened. And an interesting sort of, you know, pinnacle at the top and buttresses sort of holding the whole thing up. So it really is quite an interesting piece of miniature church design, if you like. And say he stenciled these walls, which sadly, I mentioned fashions changed. In the 1960s, this was all painted over. It was completely covered over. And thankfully, I think from the work of the Church's Conservation Trust, this has all been restored. So the paintwork has been removed. So we see John Aldred Scott's original design. So a really worthwhile piece of work there. John Aldred Scott was also commissioned in 1882. He re-roofed the aisles and he installed these rather interesting pendant gas lights. We saw those. This is an enlarged picture from the postcard. There's 18 gas lights on each one of these chandeliers, if you like, each fitting. Sadly, initially they were converted to electricity, but they were actually removed in 1931. Now, this drawing on the right here was a drawing that I found in the Victorian Albert Museum. It's actually a catalogue of a company that was based in Coventry that was involved in manufacture of church fittings, and the company's name is Francis Skidmore. And we know that Francis Skidmore was actually a friend of George Gilbert Scott, John Aldred Scott's father. And this particular pendant was designed for Hereford Cathedral. I think you will agree there's an amazing similarity between these two designs. So either somebody copied this design or, as I suspect, John Aldred Scott had these manufactured in Coventry by Francis Skidmore. Aldred Scott also had installed a 2-manual organ in 1884. This is the organ today, but it's not in St. Peter's. It's actually in Christchurch in Moss Side in Manchester. And they're taking good care of it. They purchased it in 1983. They had it redecorated. It's actually not being used functionally as an organ case. It just blocks off one particular part of the aisle, and their organ is actually further down in the chancel, but it just blocks off a blank end. But they've really done it proud, and probably done it in something like the colour scheme that was probably intended when this organ case was within St. Peter's. But I haven't been able to find a picture, certainly not in colour, of this before it was actually removed. The current instrument in St. Peter's, I understand, came from a United Reformed Church in Derbyshire, but I don't believe it's actually working at the moment. So the original one doesn't work, only the case survives, and the one at St. Peter's is not functional, but at least it gives you an idea. Oh, and this statue, Mary, is not part of the design. That has nothing to do with it at all. That is standing in front. It's just the case behind. Before we leave, let's just have a quick look at the chancel and the nave. And I mentioned that when we were outside looking at the east end, if you look at that circular buttress, which is like half a pillar, if you like, it's sort of semicircular. It's got 2 of these feet at the bottom of it. And although it's outside, it's quite obvious that it was built, it was designed at the same stage. And this is in the nave. You may have walked past it and you perhaps thought, that's a bit rough, isn't it? Well, there's a reason it's a bit rough. And the reason is that before they started the restoration, the floor level within St. Peter's was up here. This was floor level here. And it's actually been lowered down by like sort of 2 or 3 step depths further down. So that's why you've got this sort of rough hewn stone at the side. It was never intended for public display compared to what's shown up here. So the 12th century Norman mason would probably have a fit if he saw that today, but there we go. And then looking at the chancel, this is another part of John Aldred Scott's work. He was asked to lay this flooring, and they're encaustic tiles that have been laid in the chancel. So you've got, as I've shown you, that rather dramatic picture of the way that it sort of steps up. So it's quite a significant rise from the nave floor up, right up to the altar. A postscript to this story that I found in my research, a press report in the Northampton Mercury in 1889, a Reverend Dr. Sanders, I know very little about, but he commented that he'd been on a visit to Trondheim in Norway. And he says that he was amazed to see a wall in Trondheim Cathedral almost identical to St. Peter's East End. Well, identical perhaps not, but I think you'll agree there are certain striking similarities here. So this is Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, Norway, and this is St. Peter's. So, you know, there are certainly some interesting, and realise that this is St. Peter's as it has been restored, and the roof that George Gilbert Scott has chosen to put in here, this is the original roof that has remained unchanged from when this cathedral was built. And we know from documentary evidence that this particular transept is actually one of the transepts of the cathedral. It's not, you're not looking at the transept, this is a transept. Was actually built between 1150 and 1160. So it's incredibly close in date to the date when St. Peter's was being constructed. So I think this is a particularly interesting piece of research. And in fact, the person who's done the research has actually coined the phrase the North Sea School of Architecture. And I suggest that St. Peter's possibly ought to be included in that North Sea School of Architecture, because the article actually goes on to compare in detail the architectural features of Nidaros Cathedral in Norway with Southwell Minster and Lincoln Cathedral. And there are some incredible similarities. So we can speculate that maybe there were Norman architects and masons who travelled from Normandy to Norway and possibly passed through Northampton. People took what seemed to us to be quite strange routes for some of their journeys. They would tend to use coastal shipping routes. So if you wanted to go from Normandy to Norway, the most obvious way, you could either go by land, well, that there could be issues about traveling by land. So if you just hop across the channel, then you can travel by land right up to the north of Scotland, and then you've got a relatively short sea crossing across to Norway. The other way that they would possibly have done it, rather than by traveling by land up through Great Britain, is to actually use coastal shipping and hop from port to port up the east coast. That was another popular way of sort of getting yourself about. So my suggestion is, I think it's highly possible. We can't say for certain, but it is possible that there is some connection, some influence in design ideas between these groups of churches. Well, that really concludes what I wanted to say this evening. And I hope you'll agree that what we see today is not a redundant church, but it's a living building. It's just like a person, it changes over time. It's a fine example of Norman building work. And if it just gets left, bits start to decay and fall away, and they need to be replaced. And it's the responsibility of each generation to keep that building vital and alive in every sense. Its current custodians are the church's Conservation Trust, supported by the Friends of St. Peter's and All Saints Parish. And if you'd like to support the work of the CCT, you can donate via their website, which is easy to remember, visitchurches.org.uk. Or if you're not a friend of the Friends of St. Peter's group, of which this talk this evening is sponsored by, you'd be most welcome to join us. So I can encourage you to have a think about that. And again, easy enough to remember and to find us. That's FOSTP, Friends of St. Peters.org.uk. And finally, if you want to know a bit more about Scott, two sources I can recommend. Highly recommend the website gilbertscott.org, which again is really easy to remember. The website is actually maintained by the great-great-grandson of George Gilbert Scott, who actually is still a director with his sister of a company, not the architectural business, but a company I think called Wax & Co, who produce ecclesiastical furnishings and garments and that type of thing. And that's where he fits in. But he has this website called gilbertscott.org, which celebrates the whole of George Gilbert Scott's architectural work. So it's a massive resource, and St. Peter's is mentioned on there, and many of the other, not all, but many of other churches. And if you want to look out for a book, the book to look out for is actually quite a recent book. It's by Gavin Stamp, which many of you will have be aware of. He often has appeared on television. But he's written a book called Gothic for the Steam Age, an illustrated biography of George Gilbert Scott. It is a splendid book. To be honest, I haven't got a copy, but my local library has a copy because it's rather expensive. So have a look and see if your library's got a copy. If they haven't, nag them to get one. It really is a book that you need to have a look at. It's a large book. It's lavishly illustrated. It's got, the first section is really a biography with lots and lots of pictures of George Gilbert Scott. And then the rest of the book is really a gazetteer of all of the buildings and projects that he's worked on, churches and municipal buildings, hotels, commercial work, lots and lots of stuff. And it's a real treat. So maybe Christmas list or something. It's available on all booksellers' websites. There we go. I'm done. I'll take